Well, welcome to session 7. We're finally in the home stretch here of awesome ideas in Judaism. Our topic today is going to be Torah. And I misread the subtitle of this like 3 times before I finally caught what Rabbi Green did. The people and the book. People and the book. Frequently you hear Jews spoken of as the people of the book. But the people and the book is what we're talking about today, because we're interrelated. I think as you'll see, there's a lot about Torah that sort of defines Jewish culture and shapes Jewish culture, and we in turn shape it. Just a reminder on the format of each session here. We'll begin defining the idea in question, sort of defining the idea of Torah, which is, a big one. But I have actually kind of 2 approaches that I think will hopefully help clarify things. We will explain and expound on the ideas and sources that Rabbi Green brings, and we'll talk about how this idea connects into Jewish life and practice as we know it. I have some thoughts about that, and you're welcome to share your thoughts along the way for any of all those things. You're welcome to ask questions as well. You can type them in the chat. You can use the little hand raise button in Zoom. I'm able to see at least the first, 8 or so of you. So if you raise your hand on your screen, I may see it, I might not. If you're doing that and I'm not calling on you, take some other actions, I think, and make sure I see you, because I don't want to miss any questions when they come up. And like I said, you're very welcome to share your own thoughts and experiences, especially in the last section, how you relate to Torah, maybe how it's shaped Judaism as you know it. So to begin with, I think we got to start off defining Torah, which I think for kind of an intro level course, this is an important thing to do. But I kind of want to split my explanation into 2 here. I want to talk about first Torah with a capital T, as in the Torah, and I also want to talk about Torah with a lowercase t. And if that's not a way you've ever sort of heard about it, this is not a technical definition perhaps, but this is kind of one of the ways that I understand. I'd like to help explain these concepts. So we'll start out talking about Torah with a capital T, which fairly straightforwardly refers to the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. They're often called the 5 books of Moses, also called the Pentateuch, which is just another way of saying 5 books, but in Greek. There's no test on this, so I'm just going to assume everybody knows the 5 books: Genesis, also called Bereshit in Hebrew, Exodus, or Shemot in Hebrew, Leviticus, also known as Vayikra, Numbers is Bamidbar, and Deuteronomy is Devarim. I'm going to continue to use those English titles just because I think they're probably more broadly familiar, but we in Jewish tradition also call all the books by their first word. So if I slip up and I use a term you're not familiar with, make sure you get my attention to get some clarification. So of course this is not the entirety of Jewish scripture, although it is certainly from our perspective the most important, the focal point. We read the Torah through beginning to end over the course of the year as part of our synagogue service. But it's not all there is to Jewish scripture. An easy way to remember the whole is the acronym Tanakh, which is a Tav, a Nun, and a Kaf. Three letters representing 3 sections of Jewish scripture. The Tav is for Torah, that's the first one. The Nun is for Nivi'im, which means prophets. So that's all the prophetic books. That's the ones with guys' names: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Obadiah. Those guys. Those are all the prophets. The Nivi'im, and the Ch of Tanakh is Ktuvim. That letter Kaf, when it's the first letter in a word, gets a hard K instead of a soft Ch. So you get Ktuvim, which means writings, and that's all the other genres. Things like Psalms, things like Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs. So Tanakh, Torah, prophets, and writings. That all together is Jewish scripture. And there's a way it's also sort of appropriate to talk about that all as Torah as well, even though Torah is a specific section of it. Sometimes we'll use Torah in a less technically defined, broader way. And sometimes you'll hear people talk about all that as if it's Torah, even if it's not technically precise. Now, the term 5 books of Moses deserves a little bit of unpacking because it's a little bit, I think, opaque. Only one of those 5 books, and Deuteronomy, purports to be, in its own text, actually Moses's words. And Deuteronomy, purports to be the content of Moses's speeches to the Israelites as they're standing on the other side of the Jordan, ready to enter in the land. It's like his big, long discourses. It's called Deuteronomy in English because it's second teaching. It's a kind of a recapitulation of the story so far. And it's supposed to be Moses's own words. 3 of the other books, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, certainly do feature Moses prominently, but actually don't have any sort of internal claim that he is their author. And of course, the events of Genesis unfold entirely before Moses' birth, all the way back to the creation of the universe. So it's a little bit, opaque. I would say maybe a little bit misleading almost to throw around the term 5 books of Moses without diving in a little further into what that actually means, or what the origin of that term is really. Attributing all of the books of the Torah to Moses basically came about as a result of Jews asking the entirely valid question of where did this all come from? But also having little evidence to go on outside of the text itself, right? The ancient Jews weren't in the business of archaeology or, comparative analysis across cultures or anything along these lines. They had the text itself, and they wanted to know, where did this come from? So the tradition that came up was that they're ascribed to Moses. How did we get there? We can actually do a little bit of unpacking from bits of text itself to trace this. So the word Torah, outside of its context, is a proper noun referring to the Torah, referring to the 5 books of Moses, means teaching. And there's lots and lots of references in the text of the Torah to something like, this is the Torah of, in other words, the teaching of a particular something, a particular kind of offering, a particular kind of ritual purity or impurity, something like that. I brought just one example, and there are lots here in source number 1 on the source sheet from the book of Leviticus. Moses is speaking for God, saying, "Command Aaron and his sons thus, Zot Torah Ta'olah." This is the ritual. I mean, that's how the text translates it, but something like the teaching about the burnt offering. And then it goes in the context of here's what's that, the content, here's what that teaching is. The burnt offering should remain where it is upon the altar, and the next section that follows is all about how to do the burnt offering. So it's clear in this sense, the Torah is not the 5 books of Moses. It's talking about, this is the specific teaching about how to do this specific kind of offering, right? So that's one use of Torah in the text. We also get references to God's Torah, as it were, God's teachings, and how Israel is basically supposed to follow them. Here's an example in source number 2 from the book of Genesis, where it's, we sort of pick up mid-sentence, but it's talking about Abraham, in as much as Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, mishmarti. Here we have Torah, Toratai, my teachings, but alongside these other words, Abraham obeyed me, kept my charge, meaning mitzvotai, my commandments, chukotai, my laws, vitorotai, and my teachings. Implying that those are different things. Like, normally we would think of the Torah as identical with the mitzvot, but within the Torah's own language, it seems to be something different. There are commandments, laws, and teachings that are somehow different. That's not we're not going to go into interpretation of those things today, but just another example of how within the text of the Torah itself, the Torah uses that word to mean something like teachings, God's teachings about some other specific topic. We really only get the sense that the 5 books together constitute something called the Torah in the last book, in the book of Deuteronomy. And that's the place where it's seemingly a reference to the text itself. So for example, here in source number 3 is right at the beginning of Deuteronomy. Like I said, this is supposed to be Moses' speech to the Israelites. So it says, Be'evar HaYarden, on the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound et Torah hazot, this Torah, this teaching. He said, and that's the content, and thus begins the text of his speech. So this is the only place where we have this kind of construction, this Torah, and it seems to be referring to the text that's about to follow, right? We also, so if that's the case, if the text that we're reading is the text of the Torah, we can then read that back into the story of what was revealed to Moses at Sinai, and we come to understand that the Torah, i.e. the 5 books themselves, was actually the content of that revelation. Check out chapter 24 of Exodus here, where we're at Sinai. It says, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Moses said, Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and wait there, and I will give you the stone tablets, Luchot ha'even, Veha Torah, with the teachings, Veha mitzvot, and the commandments, Asher katavti lahorotam, that I have inscribed to instruct them. So, taking Deuteronomy's understanding of this text that you're reading right now is called the Torah, reading it back into Exodus, where it says Moses got the Torah at Sinai. Now we come to the understanding that what did Moses get at Sinai? This book that you are holding and reading right now, or this scroll, I guess, that you are reading from right now. And that's how we get the kind of standard dogmatic tradition of what, as I like to say, Torah leMoshe miSinai, the Torah to Moses from Sinai. That's the content of those 5 books. That's the sort of traditional, pious, dogmatic understanding of what that revelation was. Does that make sense so far? Any questions about how we get there? Stephanie's scrunching up her face. I love it. That usually means there's a good question coming.
Oh, thank you. That doesn't make any sense.
Okay, good. Why?
Well, because if supposedly he's saying Deuteronomy comes when he's at the Jordan,
mm-hmm.
That's long after he supposedly got all the 5 books at Sinai.
Right.
I mean,
maybe not even to mention the stuff about the creation of the universe, which, was he there for that? Like, no, right? Or all the stuff that happened before his birth, right? So you're absolutely right. It doesn't make sense. Oh, Kaylee raised her hand. Please go ahead, Kaylee.
It sounds like from this perspective, Moses knew everything that was going to happen to him and everyone else after it was revealed to him, but somehow that did not affect his actions in any way.
Yes. So we have both Stephanie's wildly heretical interpretation and Kaylee's nicely pious interpretation. I'm just joking with both of you. But that's the explanation that's come to. Since we did this sort of textual linking up here, linking up Deuteronomy back into Exodus, we say, okay, the Torah must have been given at Sinai. How did Moses know to write it all then? Well, he was a prophet, right? He must have used his powers of prophecy to know what happened both before his birth from the beginning of the world, and also there's about 12 verses right at the end that take place after Moses' death. You are not the first people to notice this, and in fact, it wasn't even in the modern era when folks first took notice. This one of my very favorite commentators, Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra, from about the 11th century, I'm pretty sure. In his comments on the last 12 verses, basically writes, "There's a great secret here, and whoever knows it will keep quiet." Basically, he couldn't come right out and say this clear, these 12 verses that describe Moses after, Moses' death and burial. He couldn't come right out and say Moses couldn't have written those. But he also knew that something didn't add up. So like I said, this became the standard dogmatic tradition about where Torah comes from. It's where we get 5 books of Moses, that idea from. From a critical perspective, that's not gonna necessarily cut it for an explanation. And beginning with Ibn Ezra, but continuing into the modern era, the critical perspective that doesn't sort of take at face value this understanding as the Torah as one complete work, all transmitted to Moses at Sinai, doesn't take that for granted, but rather takes into account historical and archaeological evidence, as well as the literary evidence, within the Torah in terms of its style, its vocabulary, other texts from around the ancient Near East that we've discovered and translated and compared with our Torah text. That critical perspective points us towards the understanding that what we now hold in our hands and think of as a single text is in fact actually a composite text.
Yeah.
Previously independent source texts, which represented different times and came from different times and different places and represented different perspectives, were at some point basically spliced together by later editorial hands. There's a the scholars who came up with this theory were brilliant, but apparently not all that creative. They identified 4 main sources in the Torah, and they called them J, E, P, and D. Right? They couldn't come up with anything cleverer than a single letter. But in any case, the idea is that those each represent somehow a pre-existing independent source that an editorial hand came along and combined together, and probably at multiple stages. There was probably an initial editorial process of J and E together. Scholars are split over whether D was edited in next or whether it was P. This is all through the process of literary criticism, basically taking some of the same approaches we use to interpret the classics of Greek literature, try to figure out where they came from and who wrote that and when. Taking the same techniques, bringing them to biblical liturgy or biblical literature, helped produce this theory. They call it the documentary hypothesis, that there were different documents that eventually came together. So that single text, the single text of the Torah that we now know, because we treat the Torah as one unified document, the critical approach teaches us that it actually came about as a result of a process, which we call both redaction, in other words, the actual kind of redacting, splicing together, but also canonization, the process of making that text into sacred text. This process was also at work through the rest of the Tanakh. How did we get the books of the Tanakh that we have? It's because they were edited together, right? They were, actually just in our Torah study today, we talked about the book of Isaiah, how there's clearly within Isaiah, there's a first Isaiah, and then it's clearly a totally different person who wrote about 200 years later, who wrote the second half of Isaiah. And that's pretty clear from the tone and the content and the vocabulary and all the stuff. But it's been edited and the seams sort of blurred for us. So we have to use these critical techniques to unpack that. Okay. We could do a whole series of classes on critical theory. Do we have enough so far that we've reached an understanding? Any questions about either the kind of traditional understanding, Torah Moshe Sinai, or our more critical understanding that this came about as a result of a human process? How are we doing?
I thought that the general consensus was that Moses got the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai.
Yeah, it depends who you ask. So we were talking about this the other day too, right? That in terms of how the text of the Torah presents it, the 10 Commandments are what God said before. The people were like, we can't handle it anymore. Moses, you come mediate for us. So that is one approach that's been offered, is that was only the 10 were the content of the revelation. Everything else is somehow secondary or produced by Moses or something along those lines. That's one theory. Yeah. Although, that was also not the sort of rabbinic standard. That was the minority, you know, semi-heretical view. The sort of mainstream.
Tablets.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What tablets did Moses break when he came down the mountain? Everything was written on those?
Presumably. Yeah, I think if you spend too much brain power thinking this through, you're not actually going to get anywhere useful, because it doesn't, you know, it doesn't actually accord with well, sort of logical, you know, rationality here, right? Okay. Any other questions? Susan got a word in edgewise. So see if anyone else has questions about either of these two understandings. Okay. So this leads actually to a really important insight, which is that because the Torah wasn't composed in one sitting, you know, we're really used to thinking of books as, you know, coming from a single author who basically wrote them straight through, right? But because that's not the case with Torah, that it was written by different authors at different times and combined at some later time, and that was part of an ongoing process, what we learn is basically that the later parts, in other words, the parts that were composed or added on later, actually know and are familiar with the earlier parts. And as a result, they're already beginning within the Torah itself to begin this process of interpretation and revision and commentary. The book of Deuteronomy is the classic example for this. We know through the critical method that the book of Deuteronomy actually has much more in common with the books that follow it, the books of Joshua and Judges, and also the books of Kings. It has much more in common in terms of vocabulary, style, things like that. That's probably the original literary unit. It has much more in common with the books that follow than the books that precede it. So what we think happened was, at some point, Deuteronomy, that's the D of the JEPD, got broken off of that and attached to the Torah, basically. And we think that partially because there's the second telling that's going on of the events of the Torah so far, where Moses kind of does this reinterpretation of things. He restates the Ten Commandments, right? He restates what happened at Sinai, and is actually in the process kind of changing and interpreting and making meaning out of these events. You know, again, anew, you know, for his time and place, or at least that's what Deuteronomy purports to be. And you know, not only that, but all the other Jewish writings that were going on at the time, the prophetic books and the other, right? They're all in dialogue with one another, and we can use a critical process of trying to date, you know, and determine literary dependency relationships, things like that, to try to figure out which texts are later, which texts are earlier. And what we find is the later texts are actually working with the earlier texts. So we can see this process basically of Torah interpretation already happening within the Torah itself, which is super cool. That usually doesn't happen in books, right? In order, you know, when an author writes a book, you got to wait for the sequel to figure out, you know, how the author has changed, what, you know, where the story is going to go, right? Here we have within the same book already, you know, a process of interpretation and meaning making. Okay. So that's Torah with a capital T. And you can tell we're leading into something a little bit more expansive than that when we start talking about interpretation. And that's where I think it's useful to start talking about Torah with a lowercase t. So I want to recall, I'm going to quote directly from my notes here, back in session 3, when we talked about halakha, right? That normative praxis, right? The path that one walks. And there we said the Torah is understood within a traditional framework to be the content of the revelation to Moses at Sinai, but it's also always been evident that the written Torah on its own doesn't serve as a suitably comprehensive guide for our behavior, right? We talked about how things like, you know, in the Ten Commandments, it says, lo tirtzach, do not murder, or perhaps do not kill. What does that mean? Can I kill in self-defense? We need more explanation, right? Can I eat my milk and meat together? Doesn't say that explicitly, but we can interpret that from the text, right? So as long as there's been a written Torah, it's been accompanied by this continual explication and interpretation, the traditional content of which was primarily transmitted orally, right? That's where we get things like, when the Mishnah is codified, they're drawing on this oral tradition and basically writing it down for the first time. That had been the ongoing process of Torah interpretation and explication. We spoke back then about how the Torah has always needed to be interpreted and explained in order to clarify its directives, what we're actually supposed to do, but also to suit our changing circumstances. So Rabbi Green notes in his book that, this applies to things like technological advances. Can I open the refrigerator on Shabbat? Well, the Torah didn't know what a refrigerator was. But we have to deal with that. We have to make a ruling one way or another. Is cloning kosher? Obviously, the Torah had no idea that it's possible to recreate another life form through cloning. We need to look back into that text to figure out what to do today. So we need to do this interpretation and explication in relation to changing technological advances, but we also need to do it in relation to evolving moral perspectives. And he brings a couple of examples that I'll show you here, because he touches on he sort of talks about them but doesn't necessarily show them to you. He mentions this one from text number 5 at the top, which is commonly called in rabbinic literature the Ben Sorer Umoreh, the wayward and rebellious son. Basically, if a person has a son who doesn't listen to his parents, even after they discipline him, what do? Well, he's taken out into the center of town, and they say he's a glutton and a drunkard, and they stone him to death. Now, the rabbis realized if this was actually the penalty for disobeying your parents, there would be no more children. And everyone who's been a child or a parent can validate me here, right? Another case, a little bit later in Deuteronomy, right, Rabbi Green cites the case of a virgin woman engaged to a man. If she is then raped, what's the punishment is to execute both her and her rapist. That is crazy. And, that even as far back as the rabbis, they realized that's morally, unacceptable. And so faced with these texts that they were just like, we can't do that. That doesn't accord with our morals as they stand today. There's been an evolution of perspective since they were written. The rabbis took it upon themselves to reinterpret those texts. The wayward and rebellious son is one of my very favorite examples of this, where basically they define the criteria for what would make a son wayward and rebellious so narrowly that they're impossible to ever fulfill. It says he's a glutton and a drunkard. What they take that to mean is he like eats this absolutely inhuman amount of food, and only if he can eat that inhuman amount of food is he a glutton. And he has to not only do that, but also be a drunkard. And in order to be a drunkard, you have to drink this inhuman amount of wine. And they say even further, doesn't heed his father or mother. This is the very best part. They say that, they interpret that to mean that can only apply in a situation where the mother and father speak with the exact same voice. In other words, the mother and father sound like the sound of their voices is exactly the same. And only if all those criteria are met, then this is a Ben Sorer or Umoreh, and then you can execute them in the town square. Effectively, still upholding this law, but making sure it's never, ever enforced. And in fact, we see this, already in the year of the Mishnah, the rabbis are strongly against application of the death penalty, despite the fact that the Torah explicitly prescribes it in not only these cases, but also elsewhere. And they say, Rabbi Green brings this example too, a Sanhedrin, that's the high rabbinic court. A Sanhedrin that executes once in 7 years is called murderous. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says once in 70 years is even too many executions doled out. Tarfon and Akiva say, had we been members of the Sanhedrin, we would never have put anyone to death. And of course, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, well, you can't never put anyone to death, or you can't let people know that we're not enforcing the death penalty. They would multiply murders in Israel. In other words, if people know you're not going to execute, you don't have the deterrence anymore. In any case, that you can already see, this attitude playing out in rabbinic texts, and essentially willfully misreading the Torah text in order to make it accord with changing moral values. Okay. How we doing so far? Any questions? We'll take a quick pause. Is that making sense? All right. So whereas we looked last time, though, when we talked about halakha, as how that process of rabbinic interpretation charts a halakha, a path, right? A sort of a normative praxis for Jews to follow. Today, when we're talking about Torah, it's appropriate to ask, what gave them the right to do that? And what gives us the right to do that, right? Didn't we just define Torah as the content of God's revelation to Moses at Sinai? Who are we as human beings to take that and willfully misread it? Right? That's like actually a pretty significant question. And Rabbi Green cites again somewhat briefly, so I want to take a few moments to unpack it a little more. One of my very, very favorite stories in the Talmud. And I've done a little bit of cutting and pasting here to make it fit on one page. But the content of the story, it's called the Tanur Shel Achnai, literally the oven of Achnai. And it starts with the rabbis discussing, and this is actually not at all relevant to the story, but what they're discussing is a kind of oven that was constructed of pieces, but cemented together. So everyone agreed if you have an oven that's of one solid piece and something ritually impure, like, I don't know, a dead body or something like that, touches it, the whole thing is impure because it's one solid piece. But what if you have one that's made of pieces and cemented together? If I touch with my, a dead body or something touches one of those pieces, maybe because it's pieces and they're cemented and it's not a whole, only that part of it contracts ritual impurity. That's the discussion. It doesn't actually matter. But what we have is Rebbe Eliezer on the one side, and all of the other rabbis in the Beit Midrash on the other. And so the story goes, the sages taught on that day when they discussed this matter, Rebbe Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion. In other words, he had all of the facts on his side, somehow. I don't even know what that would look like, but no one could poke a hole in his argument, but still the rabbis did not accept his explanations from him. After failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer said, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, this carob tree will prove it. And miraculously, the carob tree was uprooted from its place by 100 cubits, and some say 400 cubits. But the rabbi said, one does not cite halachic proof from a carob tree. And it happens again. Eliezer says, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, the stream will prove it. And the stream turned around and flowed in the opposite direction. And they said, no, you don't bring proof from a stream. They said, if it's in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall will prove it. And they started to lean in where it would fall. And they stopped halfway. And the rabbis are like, no, that miracle doesn't work either. And Rabbi Eliezer says, if the halakha is in accordance with me, then heaven itself will prove it. And a divine voice comes out and says, why are you arguing with Rabbi Eliezer? The halakha is in accordance with him. And Rabbi Yehoshua stands up and says, and actually quotes straight from the Torah itself, back at God, says, Lo b'shamayim hi, it is not in heaven. And the Gemara explains, what does that mean? What's the relevance here? Rabbi Yirmiyah says, since the Torah was already given in Mount Sinai, we don't regard a divine voice. You already wrote it in Mount Sinai in the Torah after a majority to incline. In other words, we follow the majority of human opinions. Since the majority of the rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer, the halakha is not ruled in accordance with his opinion. This is incredibly significant. This is basically the rabbis self-authorizing themselves to do the work of Torah interpretation. They're saying, God, yes, this is the content of your divine revelation, but you gave it to us, and it's now no longer in your hands. It's in our hands. And now that you gave us all the instructions, you gave us what to work with, we're the ones who get to interpret it. And so it really doesn't matter that God's self is on Rabbi Eliezer's side. That's not the halakha. And this text is incredibly radical. I absolutely love it. And it continues actually onward after this. One of the rabbis, meets Elijah the prophet later on and gets to ask Elijah, what was God at this moment? What was God thinking? Because Elijah has special access to God and would know this kind of thing. Elijah says, God was smiling and saying, my children have bested me. My children have bested me. In other words, I gave them the tools to out-argue me, and they did it. They're doing exactly what I want them to do. So what we learn from this story is basically the Jewish value on creative explanation and explication of Torah that's validated democratically. It's the people who make the ultimate determination about what's a valid interpretation and what's not. And with regard to halakha and normative practice, what the community is going to follow, right? But even without, outside the realm of halakha, even just, deciding what this word or that word means at the plain sense level, it's the people who get to make that interpretation. The rabbis also like to say the Torah was written in human language. In other words, it's written for us to be able to understand and make sense of it. How we doing? That was a lot too. Any questions about the story of the Tanur Shalachnai or the rabbis authorizing themselves to get creative with Torah interpretation? All right.
Well, I have a question.
Oh, please. Oh, Holly, go ahead. Yeah.
I guess it just makes me wonder, like, yes, that example, the examples you gave on the previous slide, like, they align with our ethics now. Like, are there examples that go in the other direction, or like where, I don't know, where it might be a little harder to take for modern sensibilities, or like, does my question make sense?
I think so. I mean, so obviously there's been continued moral development in between when the rabbis lived and when we live, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think a great example is the, attitude towards homosexuality, right? Explicitly forbidden in the Torah. It's, described as, a toiva, some kind of abomination there. The rabbis essentially, ignore that, accept that. It's only been in the last few decades where that's been reinterpreted in light of our moral values and our sense that, all sorts of LGBT folks are human beings deserving of dignity and not, and not shunning. So the rabbis didn't get it all right at once, and obviously we're still in the process of that interpretation.
Yeah.
Are you asking, are there ones where we feel like the Torah had it right and then the rabbis took it in the wrong direction?
Maybe that's what I'm asking.
Vis-a-vis where we are now? That's a really good question. My suspicion is the answer is yes, but I don't have a specific idea at once. I mean, because there's always this kind of plurality of voices, as we'll get to, it's pretty likely that at some point someone had a comment somewhere that took Torah in the wrong direction from our point of view, right? I don't know. I'll think more about that one, Holly, and maybe I can get back to you on that one.
Thank you.
It's certainly possible that such a thing would happen.
Okay, so we get to modern day, and isn't an orthodox interpretation of something quite different from, or can it be quite different from, say, a Reformed interpretation?
Yeah, absolutely.
And therefore, you've got, depending upon which branch of Judaism you follow, then you've got different interpretations of things.
Yep.
And there's not even there's a head rabbi in Israel, but they don't have, their interpretation is not dominant over everybody else.
Yep. So yes, I mean, I would point to, not everyone on earth agrees on, on moral issues, for one thing. All the more so within the Jewish community, we don't all agree on moral issues. So that probably shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. But you're right. One example, for example, would be the role of women in society, or in Jewish community. In Orthodox community, they don't recognize women as valid witnesses, or counting towards dominion, or able to be clergy people, or things of that nature, whereas we very much do in the liberal Jewish world. Yeah, and we'll get to this a little bit, in that more than one interpretation can exist at once. There's a temptation to want to say one of these has to be the right one, the others have to be wrong, and that's just not how it works. And that said, I can very much say for myself that I think their interpretation is wrong. I think women should absolutely be rabbis and count dominion, and be full functioning members of the community. And they would point to me and tell me I'm wrong, and those two can coexist at once. If we don't sort of spell that out and address that question as part of the course of my shiur, then bring it up again at the end, would you, Stephanie? Okay. So we have basically the rabbis, and I'll go back to Avon Amachna here, basically validating their work of creative explanation of the Torah, including, effectively disregarding it. Note that they're still not overturning it. They're not saying this part of the Torah is wrong. That would be in some way outside the rules of the game, right? The way this process works is the Torah is still the Torah. It's still, for better or worse, the content, within a traditional framework, the content of Revelation at Sinai, it's still the sacred text. And what we're not authorized to do is to revoke that status. What we're authorized to do is to reread it the way we need to reread it, right? So they validated themselves doing that work. And what this leads to is basically the creation of additional genres of Jewish literature that I like to label lowercase t Torah. And the term really is used this way. You can talk about, a Torah of Shabbat, for example, that's inclusive of all the teachings, halakha and minhag, that's custom and things like that, about Shabbat. You could talk about a Torah of biomedical ethics, right? That would include ideas about, is cloning permissible, and all sorts of things. Using Torah more like the term, like the actual translation, teaching, but in the sort of broad sense of all of the literature about it, not just the capital T Torah about it. So you end up with lots of genres, other genres of Jewish literature that are engaged in this process of interpretation. Rabbi Green brings up a very primary one called midrash, which translates to something like inquiry or deep search. I like to explain it to students as midrash is stories about stories in the Bible. A lot of the time they are narrative, what they call agadic midrash or midrash agadah. Things like, we want to know more about what happened to Abraham before he shows up in the scene. What was his childhood like? And so there are stories that people have written telling about Abraham growing up. Abraham and his father's idol shop is a very well-known midrash, not actually in the Torah though, but well-known enough that some people think it is. Sometimes there's legal, what they call midrash halakha or halakhic midrash, that develops legalistic rulings based on this approach, this interpretive inquiry approach. We'll get in a little bit to what the rules of that game are too, but what this leads to is because we human beings are empowered to do this interpretation, it means that human beings are going to come to different conclusions and have different ideas about what a correct interpretation is. And multiple interpretations are able to coexist simultaneously. In a collection of midrash, you'll find one interpretation followed by another that's usually labeled davar acher, literally another word, another reading. And you'll have a totally different interpretation. And you'll get another davar acher, another interpretation, one after another. And they're all just recorded there. They're all considered valid. You know, it's at some point, this is where Midrash enters into the halachic process. If we're talking about different ideas about what we should do, what our path should be, well, eventually there's got to be a kind of a selection and normatizing process. But in theory, any interpretation derived, authentically in good faith is valid. Now, that can be a hard thing to get our heads around. How can this be possible? How can there not only be one true understanding? Like, doesn't one thing have to be right and the other's wrong? But the Jewish answer really is a resounding no. Torah being a divine revelation is expansive. It's expansive enough to embrace all of these meanings. And it works on many, many different levels, all at once. Rabbi Green's story about, coming to teach the rabbinic students and seeing the bumper sticker that's like, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, is as that was not to my class. It must have been a rabbinic class before mine, but as he says, is very much not a Jewish approach, right? If anything, God said it, I believe it, now let's discuss what it means, is the Jewish approach, right? So does that mean, that anything goes, right? Is anything a plausible interpretation? Can I make up anything I want? No. The answer is to that also no. Just one example of, the way this process has sort of defined its own rules is this. I didn't make this graphic, I borrowed it from the internet. But there's another useful acronym for you to remember. It's pardes, if you can sort of imagine some vowels in between these consonants. Pardes, which is the Hebrew word for paradise. So that's easy to remember. You can hear the sound alikeness there. Pardes is an acronym for 4 different exegetical approaches. Exegesis just means explanation or interpretation of the text. And these are 4 of the traditional modes. And actually there are many more beyond this. At the basic level, you have pshat, which is the plain, simple meaning, almost like the dictionary definition or something like that. What does a passage mean, in the plain, simple sense? There's remez, which is, what is this passage hinting at or alluding to elsewhere in the text? And you would, if you were, taking a remez type approach to interpreting a text, you might say, well, this text reminds me of something else, or it uses similar language to something else, or, it brings up in my mind a connection to somewhere else, and then I would use that something else to help explain this text. Drash functions similarly. You can hear that drash is similar to midrash. It means to search or to dig, to search deeply. A drash approach uses a metaphor, comparison, illustration through a teaching. It's another way of linking the text you're interpreting to other texts as a way of interpreting it. And sod, which means like mystery, is the kind of mysterious, hidden, like the esoteric meaning of a text. A good example of a sod interpretation, you've probably heard of gematria, the idea that all the Hebrew letters all have number values. And so if I have a word, I can add up all the number values of all the letters in that word and reach some sort of number, and then compare that to another number or another word that has the same number value and make a connection that way. That's not at all a plain sense meaning, right? We're working through multiple levels of, kind of assumptions and sort of almost mystical, translation here. But this has been validated by Jewish tradition as a valid interpretive method. I'm generally speaking a mystical one. Doesn't mean you have to believe it, but it's validated as within the rules of the game. And, the existence of these different approaches, any given interpretation can employ one or more of these. That's, not only acceptable, it probably makes your interpretation even better if it works on multiple levels at once. The real geniuses of Jewish scholarship throughout history are the ones who can construct and navigate intricate webs of connections between different texts and between different traditions across the whole spectrum of Jewish literature and thought. The real Geonim, the real geniuses, are the one who can look at a passage of Torah and connect it to places in Talmud and places in Zohar and places in Midrash, right? And bring those all together to create a new novel reading of this text, but that's fully authentic because it draws on all these Jewish sources. That's frankly how I understand my job a lot of the time as a rabbi, is connecting things to other things to create these sort of webs of meaning. And in that way, it's creative, but also grounded in grounded in Jewish tradition. So Jessica asked the crucial question here in the chat: on what basis does one select an interpretation to believe? So now we've left, when you ask that question, you're leaving the domain of Torah exegesis or interpretation, what they would call in Hebrew parshanut. You're leaving the domain of parshanut for its own sake and entering the realm of halakha, right? And as we talked about then, basically it's a democratic process. The community develops norms. It can be democratic. It can be, a matter of what endures over time. We understand it today to be a matter of individual choice, much more so than I think it's been in previous eras. Certainly at Beit we embrace, a pluralistic approach where, what's right for me may not be right for you, and that's okay, right? That's really it's a deep question. How do you select what to believe? And I'd say the other piece of the Jewish answer to that is it's less about belief in, it's less about belief in the sense of kind of a mental acceptance of it. That's what matters. What ultimately matters is what you choose to do. And so if we're telling stories about Abraham, for example, and what happened, what difference does it make what we believe about what he did as a childhood or not? What matters is what you do in the world. And so, the interpretation that you believe is the one that inspires you to action, in the world, hopefully for the good. So you've hit on really in a lot of ways, one of the essential driving questions of Judaism, Jessica, is like, I have all this in front of me. Now, what do I do? Yeah, that's what we're here to find out. And there aren't easy, straightforward answers. That's not the business we're in. Yeah, Peggy, absolutely. So I always link to these source sheets through the notes on the YouTube videos. So if you look in the notes of the YouTube video, I can also I'll put the link in chat here at the end. Don't let me forget at the end, okay? So I'll have to dig it out for you, but I can link you directly to it. That has the source sheet with this image on it. I think if you do a Google search for like Pshat, Remez, Drash, Sod, or something like that, this will come up as well. Oh, please, yeah.
And also, I just did a screenshot. Picture.
Genius. Yeah, if you hit the print screen button. Yeah.
Yeah, and
nice job. That's
a simpler way.
That does work too. Okay. So, like I said, this doesn't mean that that there are no rules, that you can say whatever you want. There's this crucial role played by the Jewish community. We interpret within the context of our community, according to our values and according to our norms. And different communities may very well have different norms and come to different conclusions and validate different interpretations. And that's how we end up with differences between Orthodoxy and Reform, for example, right?
That's a minhag, right?
I'm sorry?
Isn't it called?
Minhag. Yeah, minhag in terms of custom. Yes, yeah, different interpretations become customary in different communities. Ashkenazim versus Sephardim is another good example. Yeah, and that's also as the community, we have in a lot of ways a crucial role to play. We're sort of the system of checks and balances here, right? The community doesn't validate interpretations that aren't sufficiently loyal to the text, or that are spurious or offered in bad faith. the rabbis get into this too. Like you don't have to accept everything just because somebody said it. If they're trolling, if they're in bad faith, like no, you kick them out of the Beit Midrash. That's a great shiur for another time as well. Like my example for kids is always like you can tell any story you want about Abraham in childhood, but you can't say Abraham was a space alien, right? Like now we're leaving the domain of what's plausible within the text, and I don't think the community would validate that. Now you're just kind of being silly, right? Where's the line? I don't know. There is one though, and that's the community's role is to through its normatizing process to find that. So Rabbi Green makes a comparison in terms of Torah interpretation, how to kind of understand this process as something of an art form. He compares it to music, and I think music is a really great metaphor. It's particularly jazz. If anyone's familiar with how to make jazz, it's a great metaphor, because jazz is at the same time improvisational. It's creative. Each jazz musician is making up something new. Notes that have never been played before on the spot, right? But at the same time, it takes place within a communally accepted idiom, right? I can't show up to a jazz session and play anything I want. I can't bring my, bagpipes, right, and start playing, a Scottish jig. That's not jazz, right? But it's entirely possible I could figure out how to play jazz on bagpipes, right? I would have to work within that idiom of the right notes and the forms and things like that. So that's how Torah interpretation works. It's both creative and individual, but also there are rules, there are bounds, and the community creates that. There's a commonly defined idiom that we work within. And I really wanted to bring this quote from Rabbi Green about what the effect of that is. Interpretation opens and widens the text, allows us to find ourselves within it, to make room within tradition for our own unique perspective. But it also affirms the text. We make Torah our own as we find ourselves within it. As we work to interpret the text, we have a chance to reshape it in our own image. But as long as we're busy reading and engaging with the sources, Torah has the power to reshape us as well. And I think this is a great, transition into talking about Torah and Torah interpretation in relation to Jewish life and practice. Because, this process, the way we look into Torah to find ourselves, and also in that way validate it, we affirm it, by making it something we take seriously. We sort of confirm and reconfirm its place as the central core of Jewish tradition. We look and try to find ourselves in it, right? We bring ourselves to it and look for guidance, right? Look for values, look for support, whatever it is we need. We can go and look in Torah. And as we go and do that, we also shape it, right? The process of going and interpreting lifts up new interpretations that are potentially able to be, validated and accepted long-term by the community, right? And at the same time, as long as we're doing that, it turns around and affects us, right? The more time we spend learning about, the values that our tradition cares about, the more we internalize those values, or at least that's the idea. Let's see, somebody has a chat. How much or what parts of this process are done by individuals or by the community? Good question. I would say the work itself is always done by individuals, but and the communal aspect is sort of done at almost like a sociological level. For example, individuals have done the work of writing midrashim, right? Studying and coming up with these interpretations. Someone else later on did the work of compiling those into midrashic collections, right? Yet someone else did the work of preserving that and, you know, recopying it onto more manuscripts and passing it on. More individuals later on have done the work of taking those manuscripts and typesetting them, right? And, you know, printing them and binding them into books. And more individuals have done the work then of choosing whether to buy those books and read them or not, and study them and pass them on to other people. So it's both individual and that someone has to come up with the interpretation, but then it's up to the community as this kind of network of individuals to then validate that interpretation. Does that kind of make sense? And, you know, I think that happens through means like, does the book sell, right? Do people read it? Do people teach it? You know, this happens from rabbi to rabbi all the time. Really good interpretations that I hear, I turn around and teach to my community. And then you turn around and teach to your friends or your kids or whatever, right? Like that's how it goes. And the ones that aren't so good, you know, never make it that far.
Rabbi, could you go back to that Pardes slide for a sec, please? I had a question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so on the, especially on the Darash or on the Sold, I'm curious, are there any boundaries?
Yes. Although we're sort of leaving the domain of talking about midrash or talking about interpretation as a concept and getting more into talking about, like, for Sod, for example, talking specifically about, you know, Kabbalah and Zohar and like mysticism and that sort of particular school's approach. I would say also, you know, this is more Pardes, you know, as kind of a tool, is more descriptive than prescriptive. You know, I don't, like, an individual doesn't usually sit down and say, I'm going to do a Pshat Drash today, or I'm going to do a Remez Drash today. Usually you make the interpretation that you're going to make, and then you can sort of use these to describe them. And frequently more than one accurately describes any given drash, because it kind of weaves through multiple things. I might start with, you know, the plain sense of this is this, but it works on this other level and this other level. And that, you know, that leads me to this yet another conclusion. And in that way, so which one is it? Like, I've kind of used all of them. So I would say, I mean, yes, there sort of are boundaries, but they're not super well defined, and they kind of don't matter.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I'm glad that was helpful.
Are there multiple different meanings of drosh? Because it seems like you're saying a drosh could include these, but then drosh is also one of them.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you for catching that. Yeah. So, drosh is both a specific term to describe the sort of metaphorical comparative method of interpretation, and it's also come to be used generally as sort of the word for any interpretation. Like, sermon sounds sort of, I don't know, churchy, I guess. So a lot of times Jews like to say, the rabbi gave the drash. That doesn't necessarily mean he specifically used the drash method, but it means I used, whatever method I did, we just call the whole thing the drash. I'd say interchangeable terms are drash or devar Torah, a word of Torah, or if you're feeling Yiddishkeit, you could say a vort. A vort is a word too. It's usually like a short little drash, or short little exegesis or sermon or something like that. Those are all kind of functionally interchangeable. That sort of makes sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks. So in terms of connecting all these ideas about the role of Torah interpretation in Jewish life, it's notable that in addition to public reading of the Torah's text becoming part of our communal prayer ritual in synagogue, we part of basically every Shabbat morning service, in fact on Mondays and Thursdays, if you daven on those days as well, is reading Torah out loud, like the literal text of Torah, we read it out loud. It's also become customary to share a piece of Torah interpretation, right? That devar Torah, that drash, that frequently that's the rabbi's primary duty in services. But in fact, actually every Jew is authorized and empowered to interpret and to teach. And there are folks on the call right now who've had that role of Beit before, of being Torah interpreters and teachers. It doesn't, rabbis are, we learn, and we make sure to do as much learning as we can so that we can basically do better drashing, right? We can create better and more interesting and more effective in terms of meaning making connections, the kind of connecting different things to different things. But any Jew who can connect any two texts together can give a drash, right? You students, you do it all the time. Every time you say, this thing you just said, Rabbi, reminds me of this other thing, you just made a drash, right? You just connected something to something. And all you need is a third point, and now you're starting to form the web. So it's in that way like become another pillar of Jewish life and practice. We formalized it as part of our prayer ritual in synagogue. It's also really a focus of our essential rite of passage, becoming bar or bat mitzvah in this day and age. The focus is really significantly on the Devar Torah, the word of Torah, the drash that the students expected to deliver. Certainly the way I like to prepare students, that's a big part of my focus. Because to my mind, even more than the skills like chanting Torah or leading the prayer service, this is the essential Jewish skill, right? This is where, as Rabbi Green says, we bring life to the Torah and Torah to life. This is where we do that, what Rabbi Green's talking about, opening the text up, finding ourselves within it, letting it shape us and also shaping it. Like what I want more for a bar mitzvah than anything is to feel like they are a part of that they have a sense of ownership over the Torah, that it's theirs to interpret and work with, and to feel like they are being shaped by it, that they're learning from it, right? And to take their place within this thousands of years old community of Torah interpreters. So to me, that's like the essential thing of bar mitzvah, and I really emphasize that. I think that's shared by a lot of rabbis and a lot of communities, that's something we really value, from our adult Jews, our young adult Jews. And I would say, in terms of the other connection, the other big connection to Jewish life and practice, like this is the engine that drives Jewish creativity. Torah interpretation, as we've said, not only has a role in shaping halakha and in terms of shaping normative praxis, but Jewish literature, but both, religious literature, but also, poetry, fiction, art, Jewish music. Torah has created the idiom within which Jewish creativity can take place. If you ever are discussing with somebody sort of what makes something Jewish or not, like definitely part of it, some piece of Jewish art, is it Jewish or not? Part of that discussion is, well, did a Jew make it? And part of it is also like, how does it connect to Torah, in the sense of how does it connect to other pieces of Jewish life or practice or Jewish text or tradition, right? You find it's very common for Jewish artists, writers, musicians to sometimes work in, pieces of Jewish stories or allusions to Jewish stories, or, even to the Torah itself or to other parts of Jewish tradition. It's kind of like I said, it's the engine that drives creativity, because it's in some ways restricting. When you can't talk about anything in the world, you have to get creative. When we can only talk about Torah, you have to get creative about, how do you explain it? How do you make it new again? And you might think that would eventually lead the well to run dry, that we'd finally say everything there is to be said about a given passage of Torah. But that's actually the beauty, right? We've woven the repetition of Torah into our year cycle through the calendar, right? Through the parsha readings each week. But every time we go back and encounter the same bit of Torah, we're different, right? We're a year older than and everything around it. Everyone in the world is a year older, and there's we've changed. So we're constantly coming back to the same Torah over and over, but because we're different, we find different things in there. And we're in turn differently shaped by it every time we encounter it. So it's it's constantly in this process of renewing us, and we constantly renew Torah because we come back to it over and over, and it actually doesn't get old. I mean, I'd say that's not true all the time. There's plenty of passages of Torah that I've frankly had enough of. I don't necessarily want to go back and spend more time looking at the Ben Sora Moreh or things of that nature. That's okay. There's a lot out there, and there's always more to dig in or to find, and sometimes being guided to do that one more time is just the the kind of push that you need to look for something new or to discover something new that you didn't know was there before. So that concludes my shiur. I'm curious from you folks, how do you feel like Torah interpretation fits into your Judaism? Is it something you are interested in doing more about? What do you feel like you need to do it? More learning, more opportunity, someone to nudge you up to the bima. I don't know. Thank you all so much for listening. I'm curious what you have to share.